Some fears are born from the unknown, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when you least expect them. For Thomas, Camilla, Kevin, and Maria, a simple weekend getaway turned into a nightmarish experience that they would never forget. They checked into an old roadside motel, tired from their long drive and eager to rest before continuing their journey. The motel was unremarkable, a relic from a bygone era, with faded signs and peeling paint. But it was cheap, and the rooms seemed clean enough, so they didn't think twice about staying the night. They were assigned to 2 adjoining rooms, each with 2 beds. Thomas and Camilla took one room, while Kevin and Maria settled into the other. The rooms were small, with outdated furniture and dim lighting that gave everything a yellowish hue. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and musty carpets. Exhausted, they unpacked their bags and decided to get some sleep. The plan was to wake up early and continue their trip before dawn. As they prepared for bed, Camilla noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible noise seemed to be coming from under the bed. It was a soft, scratching sound, like something was moving beneath them. She mentioned it to Thomas, who dismissed it as the creaking of the old building settling for the night. They laughed it off, but the uneasy feeling lingered. In the other room, Maria also heard a noise. It was similar to what Camilla had described, a faint scratching that seemed to come from nowhere. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to the wind or maybe even a mouse. Kevin assured her that the motel was probably just old and full of quirks. Still, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, the noises grew louder. The scratching became more insistent, almost frantic, as if something was desperately trying to escape from under the beds. Camilla was now wide awake, her heart pounding in her chest. She nudged Thomas, who finally agreed to check it out. He leaned over the side of the bed and peered underneath. What he saw made his blood run cold. Beneath the bed, barely visible in the darkness, was a pair of glowing eyes staring back at him. The eyes blinked slowly, as if they were studying him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Thomas gasped and shot up, his mind racing. In the other room, Kevin had also decided to investigate the noise. He grabbed his phone and used its flashlight to illuminate the space under the bed. His heart skipped a beat when he saw a shadowy figure curled up against the wall. It was humanoid in shape, but far too small to be a person. The figure remained still, as if it was pretending to be invisible. Both rooms were now filled with a tense, almost palpable fear. Thomas, Camilla, Kevin, and Maria were all too scared to move, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just seen. The motel seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unspoken menace. The scratching sounds intensified, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to echo through the walls. Thomas and Kevin knew they had to get out. They whispered their plan to the others, trying to remain calm despite the terror that gripped them. Slowly, they gathered their things, careful not to make any sudden movements that might provoke whatever was lurking beneath the beds. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. As they reached the door, the lights in both rooms flickered. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, each one speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The shadows under the beds began to move, creeping out from their hiding places. The glowing eyes grew brighter, their gaze fixed on the group as they tried to escape. Panic set in as they fumbled with the door, the knob refusing to turn. The room felt like it was closing in on them, the walls seeming to pulse with an unnatural energy. Finally, with a forceful shove, they managed to open the door and burst into the hallway. The air outside the room was a stark contrast, cool, quiet, and still. They didn't stop to look back as they raced to the car, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Once inside, they locked the doors and sped away from the motel, the shadows of the night chasing them. None of them spoke for a long time, their minds reeling from the terror they had just experienced. As they drove further away, the lights of the motel faded into the distance, but the fear lingered. They knew they had encountered something beyond the realm of understanding, something that had been waiting under the bed, ready to strike. The rest of their trip was a blur, filled with sleepless nights and the haunting memory of those glowing eyes. They vowed never to speak of what happened, but the nightmares persisted, a constant reminder that some things are best left undisturbed. Sometimes, the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how much time has passed. In an old run-down motel that had seen better days, there was a mirror that held the secrets of the room's dark history. It was said that this mirror had witnessed more than it should have, reflecting not just the present, but the horrifying events of years gone by. Patrick and Eric were two friends on a road trip, eager to explore the countryside and leave behind the stress of their daily lives. They drove for hours, the sun setting behind them, until they found a small, isolated motel just off the highway. It was the only place around for miles, and they were both too tired to continue driving. The motel seemed old, its once bright paint now faded and chipped, the neon sign flickering as if it could go out at any moment. The two friends checked in, the receptionist barely acknowledging them as he handed over the key to room 13. The number didn't bother them. Superstition was the last thing on their minds. All they wanted was a place to sleep. As they entered the room, they were greeted by a musty smell and the sight of outdated furniture. The room was dimly lit, with only one small window that let in little light from the outside. But what caught their attention the most was the large mirror that hung on the wall opposite the bed. It was ornate with a gold frame that was tarnished with age. The glass was slightly warped, giving their reflections an eerie, distorted look. Patrick chuckled nervously, commenting on how the mirror looked like something out of a horror movie. Eric just shrugged, more focused on getting some rest. As they settled in, Patrick couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the mirror. Every time he looked at it, he thought he saw something move in the reflection, just out of the corner of his eye. But when he turned to look directly at it, there was nothing unusual, just their own reflections staring back. He mentioned it to Eric, who brushed it off as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. However, as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. Patrick lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, but his eyes kept drifting back to the mirror. It was as if it was calling to him, beckoning him to look deeper. The room was silent except for the occasional creak of the old building settling. Finally, unable to resist any longer, Patrick sat up and stared directly into the mirror. His reflection stared back, but there was something wrong. The reflection of the room behind him wasn't quite right. The bed looked older, the walls were darker, and the shadows seemed to stretch and move on their own. Patrick's heart raced as he leaned closer, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror changed. The room in the reflection was no longer their room, but a twisted version of it. The walls were stained with what looked like blood, and the bed was covered in torn sheets. Patrick's reflection was still there, but it wasn't him. It was a version of him that looked gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to be pleading for help. Patrick gasped and jumped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to tell Eric what he had seen, but when he looked over at his friend, Eric was staring at the mirror, his eyes wide with terror. Patrick called his name, but Eric didn't respond. It was as if he was in a trance, completely captivated by what he saw in the reflection. Patrick grabbed Eric's arm, shaking him out of his stupor. Eric blinked and turned to Patrick, his face pale and his hands trembling. He didn't say a word, but Patrick knew that he had seen something too. Something terrible. They both turned to look at the mirror again, but this time all they saw was their own frightened reflections. The air in the room grew colder, and the mirror began to fog up, as if something was breathing on the other side. The fog formed words slowly, as if being written by an unseen hand. "Get out" was scrawled across the glass, the letters dripping as if they were bleeding. Panic set in as they realized that whatever was in the mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was something far more sinister. They had to leave. Now. Without a second thought, Patrick and Eric grabbed their bags and ran out of the room, not caring about the time or the fact that they had no other place to stay. They didn't stop running until they reached their car. As they drove away from the motel, they glanced back at the building, half expecting to see something watching them from the window. The motel quickly disappeared from view, but the terror lingered. For the rest of their trip, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time they looked into a mirror, they feared seeing something that shouldn't be there. The memory of that night haunted them, a constant reminder that some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. And as for the mirror in room 13, it remains there, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest to look into its depths and discover the horrifying truth that lies within. There are places in this world where reality bends and nightmares take form. Places that exist on the fringes of our understanding, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the unsuspecting to stumble upon them. This is the story of one such place, a motel that ensnares its guests, trapping them in a nightmarish loop from which there is no escape. It was a moonless night when Jason and Lily found themselves driving along a deserted highway. The road seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, and the oppressive quiet of the night weighed heavily on them. Exhausted from the long drive and desperate for rest, they were relieved when they spotted the faint glow of a neon sign in the distance. As they drew closer, the sign flickered into focus. Motel. The building was unremarkable, a low, shadowy structure that seemed almost swallowed by the surrounding night. With nowhere else to go, Jason pulled into the gravel lot, and the two of them stepped out of the car, their footsteps crunching loudly in the eerie stillness. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness as they approached the entrance. The door creaked on its hinges as Jason pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit lobby. Behind the counter stood a man, his gaunt face partially obscured by the shadows. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to follow their every move. Without a word, he handed Jason a key labeled Room 7, his smile never reaching his eyes. Jason and Lily exchanged uneasy glances, but took the key and made their way down the narrow hallway. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the air grew colder with each step. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Finally, they reached Room 7 at the very end of the corridor. Jason unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The room was small, with a single bed and a heavy curtain drawn over the window. A single bowl cast a weak, flickering light, creating long, unsettling shadows on the walls. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and Lily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they settled in, Jason realized he had left his phone in the car. He assured Lily he would be right back and left the room. But as soon as he stepped into the hallway, something felt off. The corridor, which had seemed unsettling before, now felt like a tunnel leading into a void. Jason walked briskly down the hallway, but the further he went, the longer the hallway seemed to stretch. He passed door after door, but room 7 was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as he quickened his pace, but it felt like he was running in place. Finally, he reached a door marked 7 and rushed inside. But instead of finding Lily, he was met with an empty room, identical to the one he had just left, but without any sign of her. Jason's heart pounded as he searched the room frantically, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, back in the original room 7, Lily was growing increasingly anxious. Jason had been gone for far too long. She decided to go after him, but as soon as she stepped into the hallway, she felt disoriented. The corridor seemed endless, and each door she opened led her back to the same room. Her room 7 was eerily vacant. The walls pulsed with a strange energy, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. Lily's fear turned to terror as she realized she was trapped in an endless loop, unable to escape. No matter how many doors she opened, she always ended up back where she started. Jason, too, was trapped in a nightmarish maze. Each room he entered was identical, a perfect replica of the one before. His calls for Lily went unanswered, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The motel seemed to be toying with them, pulling them deeper into its twisted reality. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Both Jason and Lily were growing desperate, their minds unraveling as they tried to make sense of the impossible. Every attempt to escape only led them further into the motel's dark heart. The realization dawned on them that there was no way out. Finally, they each collapsed into separate beds, exhausted and defeated. The motel had claimed them, just as it had claimed countless others before. Their fate was sealed in the endless loop of rooms, with no hope of ever finding their way out. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the motel remained as it always had, silent, unassuming, and waiting for its next victims. To the outside world, it was just another roadside stop. But to those who entered, it was a place where nightmares came to life. And so Jason and Lily became part of the motel's dark legend. Their voices, faint and echoing, joined the countless others who had been trapped before them. The motel remains, a place where reality bends, and those who enter may never find their way out again, forever lost in its nightmarish embrace.